So today's speakers are Dr. Tenaha O'Reilly. He's a managing principal research scientist at Educational Testing Service, better known as ETS. Most of us had to take at least one of their exams. We have Dr. Margaret Opatz. She's a reading research scientist and a former teacher. She recently joined CAPT as a reading research scientist. So if you're using CAPT, you'll get to talk to her. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Margaret Troyer. She's Director of Literacy and Research and Development at SoR Institute. Dr. O'Reilly will start with identifying and removing barriers. Dr. Opatz will continue with assessing foundational reading skills, and Dr. Troyer will talk about SERP STAR intervention and what to do with the data. And then we have a surprise guest, hopefully.
Everyone, thanks for taking the time out from your busy schedule today to listen to our presentation. We're eager to hear from you as well. So this part of the presentation is really about identifying and removing barriers. And you can go to the next slide. It comes as no surprise that a lot of kids these days are having some difficulty with reading in many different capacities. In national and international assessments sort of suggest this. The NAEP is sort of the key one for the United States, like 33% of fourth graders, 31% of eighth graders were classified at or above proficient. And as we know, with the pandemic, these results have certainly decreased a bit. So we know there's a problem. We keep hearing that over and over again, broken record. But how can we identify the causes? And note I said causes. Next slide. Well, reading has many, many different parts. And in order to fix a problem, we sort of need to identify the particular causes. So in the case of reading, is it the case that they have problems with recognizing words? Are they able to decode unfamiliar words? Do they have sufficient vocabulary to understand the passages? Can a student read efficiently and so that they can actually comprehend? There's no barriers there. But the main take-home point here is the type of intervention depends upon identifying that type of problem. Next slide. So a lot of people have seen this sort of model. This is a Scarborough rote model of reading. A lot of people like this model. It's a good visual. And it's sort of based off the simple view of reading, which basically says there are two key components. There's a sort of a language component that becomes increasingly strategic over time. And there's a component that needs to become automatic, really about print sort of elements. And over time, these sort of form together to talk about a skilled reading, and it sort of intertwines as sort of a rope. And what you see here are some of the different types of skills that sort of go into reading, but it's actually more complex than what it actually says here. So next slide. Over the past number of years, 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of sort of research on the science of reading. And only recently, sort of in the educational news, it's sort of coming out that the science of reading is important. Around 2020, CCSO had a conference on this. And at that point, it wasn't such a big deal. But now, there's a large sort of public focus on it. Unfortunately, it's sort of focused on the foundational skills, in particular sort of phonics and these types of things. But the construct is much, much more than that. And why this is important now, as most of you know, is there's been legislation recently on the science of reading that can impact the type of assessments being used, the curriculum, and teaching. Next slide. Any questions so far? If not, we can move on.
I'm not seeing any in the chat.
Okay. So I can't see. So what's the question in the chat?
Oh, sorry, I'm not seeing any in the chat.
Okay, good. It's only early. So what we've done is that we have sort of many years ago wanted to basically look at different elements of the construct, and we created an assessment called ReadBasix. And it's based on over a decade of research, and it's consistent with the science of reading because it was based upon that at its inception. But essentially, there are 6 different subtests, and these subtests concern decoding and word recognition, so more along the lines of the public sort of lens on foundational reading skills and the science of reading. Vocabulary, academic vocabulary, that is, morphology, so prefixes, suffixes, inflectional, derivational morphology. Sentence processing, so can people sort of understand how connectors function, causal connectors, temporal, sequential kind of things like that. And then efficiency, are the pieces of the foundational skills at a level that sort of doesn't hamper the last piece, which is basic reading comprehension, that has to do with making inferences, finding information, and whatnot. Next slide. So ReadBasix can be used in a number of different ways. One is sort of for a screening function. So at the beginning of the year, you want to sort of get an idea of where your students are to sort of make decisions. One of the key pieces of ReadBasix is this sort of diagnostic component to it. So reading, as we said, isn't this sort of single unidimensional construct. There are these different areas, and 6 that we've mentioned here can sort of show you where your students are and how they can sort of improve in certain areas. It has a vertical scale, meaning you can compare students over time, monitor their growth over time, and it can be used as a measure for an outcome of intervention. We'll hear a bit more about that later in the presentation. And it's based upon large data set that has great properties. Next slide, please. So why is this particular test unique? One of the reasons is that, there's a lot of foundational reading skill measures for, say, K to 3. But if you notice the Common Core state standards, the foundational skills really kind of drop out, most of them after grade 5. And if they're not assessed, then the problems may go unaddressed. So if you give a comprehension assessment, well, the problem must be comprehension. But ReadBasix was designed to measure these foundational skills in the upper, middle, and elementary school areas over time. And we've seen, and I'll show you that in a minute, that there's actually a lot of evidence that these issues can be problematic in those areas. This assessment's also modular. You can sort of administer all 6 or one of these particular subtests. Next. So really getting that sort of a good example of why this is sort of important. We did a study a number of years ago and looked at the decoding subtest, and then we also looked at how people performed on the comprehension subtest in a fairly large sample in students in grades 5 through 10. So getting back to that issue I mentioned a minute ago about decoding, a lot of people think it's not a problem in that sort of region. And what we found, though, is that there's a particular point on the scale where if you fell below that point, there's a high probability that comprehension was going to be low. And in addition to that, we did some studies that were longitudinal that showed that if the students sort of fell below that threshold early in the grades, there was sort of no particular growth in comprehension over time. So sort of being able to know this particular threshold point, which has a pretty significant impact, is definitely very, very important. Again, if you just gave the comprehension, you'd think it's a comprehension problem. Find a main idea, maybe some reading strategies. However, we find with this particular study that the decoding could be the barrier. And being able to detect that early on is really what you want to do. Next slide. So quick summary of my part. We want to ensure that students can get the help they need. ReadBasix helps identify the barriers for reading because it has a variety of components. It's certainly consistent with the science of reading. It was designed with that in mind many, many years ago. And here's the other neat part, and you'll see in the presentation coming up. This is more about detection of an issue and what the nature of that detection is, the ReadBasix. But we found that, and Margaret will talk about that, there's also interventions that have been used to sort of fix these issues. You'll hear about that in a minute. And this measure can be used to measure growth, student growth over time.
Margaret, she's a reading research scientist, and you can say more about your background yourself.
I come to the CAPTI team as a former teacher in K-12, and specifically I have a real focus in reading and literacy, and spent the last few years in the classroom as a reading specialist working with struggling readers who were in grades 7 to 12. So I'm going to walk you through CAPTI, and it's exciting to see in the last poll that you want, or that it's important to you to have reports that are broken down by reading skill, because that's one of the key features of CAPTI based on the design of the assessment. So there are 6 subtests, as Tenaha already reviewed a little bit. what's unique about CAPTI and specifically ReadBasix is that each of the subtests can be administered independently or as a complete battery. So you can see the average minutes that it takes to complete the assessment, and then the number of items. And the number of items is really important because that helps us with the accuracy. So you're getting really accurate results because we have a large number of items, especially when compared to some other assessments. So I'm going to take you now to CAPTI, CAPTI's platform, excuse me. Okay, so now I'm going to just walk you through part of CAPTI and show you how to create an assignment, and then something else that's really exciting within CAPTI, the actual reports for students. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. Okay, so now I've logged in and I want to just quickly show you how to create an assignment. And when I say assignment, that's actually how we create the assessment. So we're talking about ReadBasix today, so I'm going to create a ReadBasix assignment. And the students that I am going to show you their data, it's from a 7th grade classroom. All students' names have been, they're all pseudonyms. So I'll show you in just a second, but I'm just going to say that this is an 8th grade fall assessment. I'm going to enter in the grade level. And down here is where you can select all of the subtests. So let's say for today, I didn't want students to take reading comprehension, and I'm just going to do the first 5 foundational skills that lead to reading comprehension. That's what I would select. And it tells you just about how long to prepare for. So it should take students about 45 minutes to complete all of those subtests. And then I'm going to also select medium, because if I'm working with 8th graders, there's 3 levels of difficulty. The low, and you can see in this little pop-up, it's appropriate for grades 3-5, medium is 6-8, and then high is for grades 9-12. So that's how I would create it. I'd go through and put in the students that I want to take it. But what I really want to show you now is the reports that are produced. So after students take the assessment, you can go into reports and you're going to be able to look at student data. And something that is cool is that you get to start off with a broad overview of how students did collectively as a group. So this is a group of 7th graders. So you'll see it broken down by the subtests, and I did have students complete reading comprehension in this data. So it shows comprehension as well. And then it also gives the RTI recommendations, and you can see how that's broken down, the number of students. And then you can really start to focus in on students. So I want to highlight a couple of students that I think are of interest, specifically when using ReadBasix. I have found students who score like Chloe, that this type of assessment can be really helpful for identifying what middle school learners are really struggling with. So Tenaha mentioned the decoding threshold, and what you're looking at here is 3 different assessments. So we have the fall, winter, and spring of Chloe's 7th grade year. And starting 7th grade, Chloe was at 229 for her word recognition and decoding, meaning she was below that threshold that Tenaha just spoke about. However, what's interesting for her is her reading comprehension was slightly higher than her ability to decode. And because I know who the student is, I have enough knowledge to know like why that might be. And it was really because her background knowledge was so vast. She had a huge oral language vocabulary, but she really struggled to make sense with the text on a page. So what her teacher did over the school year was really worked with her on intervention within word recognition and decoding. And in 7th grade, that looks different than phonics. It looked like word analysis, where her teacher was helping her break down words into syllables, knowing the syllabication rules, and then also being able to connect it to morphology by looking at those word parts and their meaning. So over the course of the school year, you can see her word recognition and decoding did increase, and it actually subsequently increased the rest of her subtest scores, because it kind of like opened up her ability to like really make sense of what was on the page, and her reading vocabulary started to become comparable to her oral language. I want to show you one other student that I think is of interest. Not that all students aren't of interest, but I found this student to be of interest as well. So I'm going to go to her report history and just show you this. So in the fall, she looked really strong in word recognition and decoding and reading comprehension. But her teacher noticed that there was something going on with Allison, that she just didn't know how to make sense of how to support Allison. So when she took the fall assessment of ReadBasix, her teacher found that she was really struggling with reading efficiency. And that construct is similar to something like the DAYS or maze. So it's a silent reading fluency measure. So what her teacher did with her is she really focused on fluency practice with repeated reading, and that really helped to increase her scores over time. So she became a lot more efficient within her reading. So I think that's a really unique lens that ReadBasix can offer, is by breaking down those foundational skills, you can really see where students are struggling, where other assessments, at least in my experience, haven't shown me as in depth. So we do also have recommendations for students, but this is a good place for me to stop because Margaret will also talk about recommendations for how to support students. So I'm going to stop showing that and go back to our slideshow.
Margaret, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
This is coming from Kate Leo. She said that the teacher's guide, my question disappeared. A second. Teacher's guide recommends to use personalized instead of the low, medium, high levels. And this is what she selected. Will her results be accurate? She works with the 9th and 10th grades.
Yeah, so her results will be accurate. The reason that I would select medium at the fall administration is because students are expected to be within that range. And I don't know if Tenaha or if you, Yevgen, have additional pieces of information you'd like to share about that, but that's why I would select the medium at the fall administration.
I will add that there's also another assessment called ReadBasix, which is a screener, which we recommend taking before ReadBasix. And that, when students take it, it automatically sets the difficulty levels for ReadBasix. So that when you select personalized, it will be at the appropriate level for them. So the reason why we have personalized is because next time students take ReadBasix, they may be taking different levels for different subtests. And when they take an appropriate level, it just doesn't frustrate them. Like imagine the students taking a very easy test or a very difficult test. So it should be closer to their level, and then the results becoming more accurate. Although the same student could take the results with the easy, medium, and hard level, and they will get approximately the same score. But if they take it at their appropriate level, where they are, you're going to have the most accurate result with the smallest error margin.
Great, thank you. Okay, one last thing that I would just like to mention is that soon the reports will have the Lexile measure included with the subtests, and this is coming very, very shortly. Also, we have made implementation very easy by having all of these systems that can easily integrate within CAPTI. So that makes it very easy to roster and then manage students. I would also like to just mention that if you do end up using CAPTI, we have several opportunities for training and support. So we have free basic training on how to use CAPT, and then we also have 2 professional development opportunities that are 3 hours each, and they go over the science of reading. And then also we do a deep dive into the reports to be able to create instructional plans. And then our next webinar is on March 29th, and that one will be all about expanding the view of the science of reading. And that's really like expanding beyond phonics.
And I'd like to invite our next panelist, Margaret Troyer.
So I'm Margaret Troyer. Just like the other Margaret, I am a former classroom teacher. I taught middle school English and then was a literacy coach. And I'm now the Director of Literacy Research and Development at SERP Institute. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is, okay, so you have this great data from this great assessment showing exactly where your students are in need of support. Now what do you do? How do you give them that support? Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you about STARI. STARI stands for the Strategic Adolescent Reading Intervention. It is a reading intervention for students in grades 6 through 9 who read 2 or more years below grade level. STARI is an open education resource. You can access the curriculum materials free of charge at serpinstitute.org/STARI. STARI was developed through a partnership between Boston Public Schools, SERP Institute, Harvard University, and Wheelock College. It was piloted by classroom teachers, revised, implemented again, and eventually evaluated using the ReadBasix. I'll talk about that data in a few minutes, but just want to say right up front that this is an intervention that is both research-based and classroom tested. Next slide, please. So how does STARI align with the science of reading? So there are a lot of interventions that really focus in tightly on a particular component of reading. One of the things that makes STARI unique, Tenaha spoke about Scarborough's reading rope and how there are both the language comprehension strand and the word recognition comprehension strand of reading. And without either one of those, comprehension is 0. You need both language comprehension and word recognition in order to be able to understand text. So STARI is unique in that STARI really addresses both language comprehension and word recognition in order to prepare kids to be stronger readers. So a lot of what we've heard about the science of reading so far is really focused on the language comprehension strand and is really focused on students in grades K1 and 2. And for those of us who work with older kids, we may be thinking like, okay, they're shoring up the foundational skills in the primary grades. Maybe in 4 or 5 years, kids will be coming to me with stronger reading skills. But what do I do for the kids that are sitting in front of me right now? So if we can go to the next slide, I will speak more about how STARI really addresses both strands. And what we call this as a theme of STARI is integrated building blocks of comprehension. Next slide, please. So we address the word recognition strand. I'm going to talk first about how we address the word recognition strand. So first we teach students syllabication, what a syllable is and how to count the number of syllables in a word. Next. We teach students how to chunk multisyllable words. That's okay, you can keep going. These animations are going to be quick. We teach students how to chunk multisyllable words, and then we teach students how to use the syllable type to determine whether the vowel in that syllable is long or short, and then be able to decode the word correctly. Next. Students are also taught morphology through explicit instruction in finding base words and affixes within longer words. And importantly, this teaching is applied both to word recognition, using the base words and affixes to be able to decode unfamiliar words, and to language comprehension, using the base words and affixes to be able to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. Next. So we also, in addressing the word recognition strand, we also do a daily fluency routine in which students engage in regular reading of connected text in order to build accuracy, automaticity, and prosody, which means you're reading sounding like you're talking. And each fluency passage also builds in practice with the decoding patterns that students are learning, for example, syllabication, to provide additional practice with that word recognition strand. Now, fluency passages also focus on nonfiction topics that are related to the unit themes, so that by reading the fluency passages, students are also building their background knowledge to help them comprehend core unit texts. And you'll remember from the rope graphic that background knowledge is a critical component of the language comprehension strand. Next, please. So now let's move on. Next. Now let's move on and think about how STARI addresses that language comprehension strand. So while STARI does include scientifically based instruction and word recognition in order to shore up students' foundational skills, the program at the same time accelerates students' progress in grade level comprehension. So STARI incorporates best practices in comprehension instruction, including robust discussion of complex text. We call that talk as a bridge to deeper understanding. As well as explicit instruction in academic vocabulary and academic language structures within the context of reading and discussing these texts, and explicit instruction in grade level skills and standards, such as making inferences, understanding metaphors, and understanding the differences among different genres of text. Next, please. And perhaps most importantly, STARI accomplishes all of these things while attending to students' motivation and engagement. So this intervention is intended for students in middle school. We know that a lot of students who come to middle school as struggling readers have experienced repeated failure in school over years and have often made the psychologically appropriate decision to disengage from school. And we know that middle school kids, if they don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. It doesn't matter how good the intervention is if we can't pull kids in and motivate them to do the work that they need to do. So we engage STARI students with really high quality, high interest, age appropriate texts and interesting and meaningful discussions of those texts. STARI is a culturally responsive program. It honors and leverages students' ideas and experiences, asking them to discuss and contrast their perspectives on the text with their peers. Next slide, please. And STARI works. So we did a study in the 2013-14 school year in Massachusetts. We used ReadBasix to assess students' progress. Those who were assigned to STARI compared with a control group who received sort of business as usual, whatever schools had in place other than STARI. And so you can see that the yellow bars are control students who did not receive STARI, normed to the 50th percentile just for ease of comparison. The blue bars are all of the students who were assigned to STARI. And you can see that across all 6 subtests of the ReadBasix, the blue students who were assigned to STARI outperformed those yellow control students who were not assigned to STARI. Now, the red bars are the students who actually completed the intended dosage of the STARI curriculum, the full 3 units. And so you can see that the red students even outperformed sort of the average assigned to STARI student. So that shows us it really is STARI that's making the difference, because the more STARI students got, the more they grew. One other point to note about that slide is that the yellow control students, 70% of them received another reading intervention other than STARI, and the other 30% received another academic intervention other than STARI. So we're not just saying STARI is better than nothing. We're saying STARI is better than what schools had in place before they started using STARI. I'll add one more piece of data point that is not on the slide. So we did, as I mentioned, this data is from 13-14. We did a larger follow-up study of STARI over the past few years that unfortunately was so disrupted by COVID that we don't really have solid data out of that study at this time. We did get some data from Jackson, Mississippi, and from New York City from the 2021 school year. The 21-22 school year, and sort of hot off the presses, that data is under analysis right now. And we also saw that STARI had a significant impact on students' performance on the Mississippi state test, in addition to having an impact on ReadBasix. So now we can go to the next slide. So what is STARI exactly? There are 3 series of materials. We explicitly call them series rather than saying, we call them series 1, series 2, series 3, rather than saying 6th grade STARI, 7th grade STARI, because there is flexibility in terms of which series is used at which grade level. Typically, people use series 1 with 6th grade, series 2 with 7th, and series 3 with 8th and 9th. There are 3 units within each series. So each series is a full school year worth of material. Each unit consists of teacher lesson plans, a student workbook, leveled fluency passages, novels and nonfiction texts, as well as ancillary materials like slides and assessment guides. Next slide, please. And again, STARI is an open education resource. All of the curriculum materials can be downloaded and printed free of charge from our website, or they can be ordered pre-printed from a print-on-demand partner. The trade books are copyrighted and need to be purchased. We also have a book distribution partner so that you can order all of these materials on our website and make it kind of really easy one-stop shopping if you are interested in accessing STARI for your school. And I believe that is it for me. If we can go to the next slide, I think it's just sort of another slide with the website on it, as well as the CAPTI website, because STARI and ReadBasix do align really nicely. And now I think we're ready to move on. Yevgen, I'll turn it back to you.
And Margaret, there's one question for you.
Yes. Tell me what it is while I try to scroll back up.
It says, can you speak to the teacher training / support recommended for STARI to be implemented well and successfully?
Yes, I absolutely can. So we have an online professional learning series that is comprehensive, and I'm going to drop the link in the chat. It is ideally something where you would take like 2 days before the start of the school year to do the first 6 sessions. And there are 17 sessions total because it's designed so that there would be a 2-hour PLC each month of the school year, so that teachers can continue to further their professional learning around STARI. It is all online. This is something that can be done independently and asynchronously, but we also have a comprehensive facilitator guide. So if you want to organize a large training, a live training, for your school or district, you can purchase a facilitator license that has access to all of the online materials, as well as the facilitator guide to help a local facilitator walk through and lead teachers in accessing and reflecting on all of the training that's available online.
And Margaret, I have one more question for you. Here's a question from Suzette Paul. She's saying she was using the word generation weekly. Is this the STARI method?
Word generation is another SERP product. So word generation and STARI have a lot in common. They were actually developed as sister programs back in around 2010-11 in Massachusetts. Both WordGen and STARI were developed in response to a problem of practice posed by this Boston public superintendent of schools, who said that students could not comprehend their textbooks when they got to high school. So a middle school intervention was the appropriate response. Word generation is a tier 1 vocabulary program that is for all students in a school. And then we know that a tier 1 program will only move results school-wide if you also have a tier 2 program in place for those students who are significantly behind grade level. So STARI was developed as kind of a sister program for those students, as a tier 2 program for those students who are significantly behind. So the programs are different, but have a lot in common since they are both sort of developed by the same research group.
And how often should the intervention be implemented? Number of times per week and the duration every day?
Yes, so we strongly, strongly recommend that schools devote at least 45 minutes a day to STARI. If you're on a 90-minute block, 8A, B-Day, that's fine, same amount of time. We have schools that are doing it in less time, that have STARI meeting only 3 or 4, even 2 times a week. You're not going to see as much progress. You saw the slide that showed us that the more STARI students got through, the more they grew. Obviously, you're not going to get through as much of the program, and you're not going to see as much progress if you don't devote the time to it. So we strongly recommend, if possible, that it be a double dose, that it be in addition to students' regular ELA class, and that students get STARI a minimum of 45 minutes a day. I know there are at least a few people on the call who are teaching STARI right now. So if you want to drop in the chat how your school schedules STARI in, that would be really helpful. We also have some resources that we can share that just show kind of different ways that schools have figured out how to fit STARI into the daily schedule.
And one more question. What are the multiple metrics you use to place students as 2 years or more below grade level?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that that can be done. ReadBasix is a great way to do that because, you know, as I think you probably saw when Margaret scrolled through all of the reports at the beginning, you can see whether students are on, approaching, or well below grade level. Often districts that we work in use state test scores. You know, the students who are different states have different ways of describing, but the students who are, you know, below basic or, you know, approaching proficient, those are often the students that's often the measure that is used to target students for STARI, and other districts use other formative assessments that they already have in place to target those students who are below grade level.
Okay, I have a couple more questions about ReadBasix. Can teachers see how students responded to individual test items? No, we specifically do not do that so that teachers don't have the temptation to teach to those specific items. So we are looking at adding reports on the subtypes of items so that you know specifically what the students are failing on, suffixes or prefixes, non-words or real words in the decoding section. And the other question is, Tenaha, if you're able to answer this question, how is the reading comprehension assessed? Passages in fiction and nonfiction?
Yes, it's mainly nonfiction.
Thank you. And I promised a surprise guest. We actually have Tracy Langley with us today, and she's an English language arts specialist in K-12 in Granite School District. So I'm gonna try to turn on the microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right.
And Tracy has, if I understand correctly, you've used both STARI and ReadBasix.
Yes. And actually we were able to procure some funding so that we can get it for next year as well, because our teachers are finding it very useful, especially the data that's coming out of it, and we're making it so that it's easier for our teachers that are teaching STARI to use it for both placement in those tier 2 reading classes, as well as helping them determine even potential extra interventions that are specific to those sub skills that students are perhaps weak in, like the word recognition and decoding and things like that. Because right now, with STARI being implemented in a lot of our junior highs, we have about several of our junior highs that are implementing STARI, and they're finding the data very useful, especially with in regards to, I should say, giving them that more accurate piece of where the students are weak, because before we just used a screener reading inventory, and that really didn't give us a whole lot of like, what do the kids need? So what kind of questions, or what do you want me to speak to for this piece?
Yeah, can I ask a question, Tracy?
Absolutely.
So I think you spoke really compellingly about the value of ReadBasix, and I can echo that as a former classroom teacher. It was so frustrating to get my students test results and know that they were struggling and they were below grade level, but not really know where they were struggling. So if I can ask you to sort of answer the same question about STARI, how have your teachers and students responded to STARI?
So with STARI, we're actually in a second year of, if you want to say, implementation. So we've done 2 cohorts. We started last year right after kind of we started getting back into the swing of like face-to-face school, right? And so now this year we have about 15 teachers in our district doing STARI, and it has been just fascinating to see how our students are responding in all sorts of ways with the STARI, especially because everything is built in. And one of the things that our teachers love is that the fluency routine takes students not only through that practice piece, and it's not just about words per minute, it's about comprehension and linking everything, about building background. And the training piece that Margaret talked about before, we had another facilitator facilitate some of the trainings for our teachers, and they've really started to put those pieces together of why all these things need to be in place, because comprehension isn't just about reading more books. It's about building that background knowledge. It's about bringing in that fluency piece and making that, I feel like, that personal connection and the motivation for our students in grades 6 through 8. I think it's just a great program that teachers can, go in and basically just, teach, because it just lends itself so well to a scope and sequence. And again, like I said, with the CAPTI piece, it gives them those tools to, again, focus more on, like, if they need to have a little bit more word study, well, you can see that in their CAPTI results and their scale scores and everything else, and then they can adjust their instruction or supplement as needed. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you so much, Tracy. If anybody has a question for Tracy, please feel free to ask. Meanwhile, there's a couple more questions about ReadBasix and STARI. Is STARI and ReadBasix only for 6 through 8? Is there a resource like STARI for grades 1 through 5? So I'll speak to ReadBasix. ReadBasix is for grades 3 through 12. If below the 3rd grade, you really should be assessing with oral reading. But once students start to read to learn, that's when ReadBasix starts in about grade 3, and it goes all the way through K through 12. If your students, through the grade 12, if your students are doing really well, they may place out of ReadBasix at some point. Margaret, what about STARI? Is there anything beyond or below the grades 6 through 8?
As of this time, no, there is not. STARI, we have 3 series, which are targeted, as I mentioned, 6th through 9th grade. We've gotten requests to expand STARI both up into high school and down into elementary school. And we are moving in the direction of expanding up into high school. We may eventually expand down into upper elementary school, but at this time it really is targeted on middle school, again, in response to the problem of practice that was posed that spurred STARI's development, that was really where the need was, that there are programs for elementary school, but nothing really for middle.
Okay, and the next question is, can the programs be used with small groups outside the school day? So ReadBasix certainly, and the STARI?
Yes, we do have some schools using it, in an extended day or after school or before school tutoring. And, depending on attendance, that certainly can be very successful.
Let's see if there are any more questions. So I think it may be worth asking a question aloud. Is whether STARI is appropriate for use for multilingual students, and the recommendations within the STARI curriculum regarding how to best place students in the appropriate series.
Yes, so I typed an answer for that, but I'll say it as well. STARI is absolutely appropriate for use with multilingual students. I'll respond to another question that I see in the chat as well, that STARI is also appropriate for use with students with disabilities, with reading disabilities. In the group of students that were in the Massachusetts schools where we evaluated STARI in 13-14, we had English learners, we had students with IEPs. Both of those groups made just as much progress as sort of the average gen ed native English speaker STARI student. I shared in my response in the Q&A, I shared a link to a page on the website that specifically addresses why STARI is a good program for English learners. And then the other question was about series. So the 3 series all address roughly the same skills, and all of the texts are at approximately the same level of challenge. The difference between the series is really the target age level of the students. So in series 1 is really targeted for younger middle school students. One of the texts is Middle School Confidential, a graphic novel about being a middle school kid. Our 9th graders are not really going to want to read that. Series 3, all of the characters in all of the novels are high school students. So our high schoolers don't feel like they're reading baby books when they read the series 3 texts. So that's why we roughly align, series 1 with 6th, series 2 with 7th, series 3 with 8th and 9th. Can you do it a different way? Absolutely. We have some schools that decide in the first year of STARI implementation, all grade levels are going to do series 1, just to increase the opportunity for teachers to collaborate and co-plan. So the series and grade level alignment is a recommendation, but it's not set in stone.
Okay, and what percentage of time is spent on decoding and syllabication?
Yeah, great question. And I can't tell you a number off the top of my head. I will tell you that the decoding lessons are fairly light touch. We do 4 to 5 mini lessons per unit on specific decoding skills. But then there is a lot of embedded practice. As I mentioned, there's a daily fluency routine where students, not only practice reading the words that they're learning to decode, but have a specific decoding activity where they practice the skill of, counting the number of syllables in a word, or chunking the syllables, or identifying, is this a long or a short vowel sound in this syllable? So that practice is built in. There's decoding practice in the homework assignments. The lesson plans cue teachers to pull decoding strategies in, during the vocabulary preview. That's part of reading the novel. Who can find the root word or the prefix in this vocabulary word that we're going to talk about? So the explicit instruction is fairly light touch, but there's lots and lots and lots of built-in practice. Sorry, I can't give a more specific answer on percentage.
And how does this program address the specific reading deficits of students with disabilities and serve as a tool for teachers when implementing students' IEPs?
Yeah, so I mentioned briefly that, we do have data to show that this is a program that can be effective with students with disabilities. And I think that, like I mentioned, STARI really kind of touches on all of the different aspects of reading, the language comprehension and the word recognition pieces. So depending on what that student's specific needs are, which an assessment like ReadBasix can help to determine what that student's specific needs are. STARI is going to meet those needs. And, you can sort of, as the teacher, focus more in one area or another, depending on what that individual student needs.
Right. Can we go to the next slide? I think that's about it for questions. We still
I see there's one more in the Q&A, Evgen. Should I answer that or?
Yes, please.
Okay. So for students in STARI interventions, how many years of STARI do they typically need? It really just depends on how far behind they are when they begin. Our students do make more than a year's worth of progress in 1 year in STARI. So if they were just 2 years below grade level, they may only need 1 more year. They may only need 1 year of STARI. If they were 4 years below grade level when they started, they may need 2 years of STARI. We do feel like we move students quickly and hope to get them back on track as quickly as possible.
Great. And Erica was in the background helping answer questions, but if you have questions for her, please email her at erica@captivevoice.com. She does have a special offer for anybody who wants to implement ReadBasix between now and the end of a school year. You can also ask for a free trial.